Good morning, everybody. Thank you for getting here bright and early, right on time. Yeah, we've got it's an in-person thing too here. There's a watch party, so I'm standing in front of a few people here in Southeast Portland and also talking directly to my laptop, which will be an interesting way of trying to engage everyone here and also engage everybody here. Interesting hybrid thing going on here. Welcome to day two of the seventh annual North American Rewilding Conference. I'm Peter Michael Bauer, and I will be talking about rewilding. I don't know, subsistence as resistance. That's the theme of the conference. We used to have multiple themes that would trade off year to year. And then I guess maybe one year we just decided that this should be our theme for the conference as a way of trying to sway the direction that the term rewilding is going, sort of a way of holding down the meaning the way that we were hoping to craft the community and craft the word itself. Um, so yeah, I'm gonna talk about the history of rewilding as a word. I'm gonna talk about the history of rewilding as a concept. I'm going to talk about the differences in those ideas and difference of how the word rewilding is used, how we use it here, and why. And then I'm going to talk about what subsistence as resistance means, so that everybody kind of has a clear picture of where we want to go with this conference as we, both past, present, and future. Um, so yeah, more and more people are trickling in, and I'm just going to go ahead and jump into it. So I came to the word rewilding in like 2004. There was a magazine called Green Anarchy that was produced in Eugene, Oregon by John Zerzan and edited by him. And they had an issue called the rewilding, which was basically, the concepts that we're going to talk about a little bit today. It was essentially their version of anarchy, but a lived version of it. And I'm going to talk more about that too in a bit. But that's how I came to it, was through that avenue. The word itself came through Earth First, which in the 1980s, Earth First, some people might not know what that is. Earth First is an activist organization that does direct action specifically to stop things like logging operations on old growth and things like that. In the 1980s, it was started by a collaboration of lots of different people, conservative and liberal, in rural areas to stop logging, to protect animals, to protect hunting grounds, all kinds of things like that. And over the years, it became more and more sort of a leftist organization. During that time, people started using the word rewilding in that context to mean multiple things. The word itself, I think, was first published in one of the Earth First journals. I have a friend, Josh Sterlin, who has been doing this sort of like archaeology, trying to figure out when the word rewilding came into the English lexicon and where. And so this is sort of his research that I'm talking to you about. And some of this I knew, but not as specific into the details as he has dug and found out. But so Dave Foreman, who was one of the founders of Earth First, used the term rewilding as a sort of conservation biology tactic, which meant removing people from an environment and letting it, quote unquote, go wild. This stems from the sort of outdated idea of conservation biology, where humans are innately flawed, and if we have to remove ourselves from the environment in order to make it look, or in order for it to be restored. This comes from, often a lot of the like pioneers and early settlers and people who didn't understand when they were coming to North America that there was actually humans that had been modifying the environments. They were what's called anthropogenic environments, basically created by people, or at least deeply influenced by the presence of humans. And these were environments that were abundant. They didn't look like your classic farmland that you would get from any sort of farm culture. Some of them did, but not all of them. And so there was a lot of abundance here, a lot of wildlife, a lot of biodiversity. And what they saw was emptiness, because most of those people had either died from disease before they were exploring those areas, or a lot of those people were just living in a smaller scale type of way of subsistence strategy. And so these conservationists, the early conservationists, basically projected this idea that humans are innately destructive because, wow, look at this pristine sort of Garden of Eden over here with no people in it, and look at the wake of human civilization as this giant destructive force. And so in conservation, that is still a big aspect. That idea still persists a lot today. However, it is being challenged for sure. I think most contemporary people would be challenging those things, but there's still this legacy of that. And so when the term rewilding was sort of born, it came out of, in part, that. Um, the other side of that was within Earth First, there were a lot of people, especially in Eugene, Oregon, that were this sort of budding ideology, an offshoot of anarchism called primitive anarchism or anarcho-primitivism, or now they call it primal anarchy. And the idea behind that is basically that for the majority of human evolution, we did not have states, we did not have hierarchies. We basically lived in what you would call a primal sort of anarchy, collectivism. Some people call it primitive communism. There's a lot of arguments over how to label how to label these social structures that humans evolved with for millions of years. And so part of the term rewilding in that whole milieu was this idea that if we really want to return to a kind of wildness, that's going to mean that we have to return to those social structures as well, and that these hierarchies and state governments and things like that have been imposed on us through agricultural taxation regimes. And that's a fundamental part of the subsistence strategy of civilization, is basically, colonizing people and forcing them to participate in basically growing grains. If you look at the word colonize, it comes from the Roman root colere, which means to till the soil. Well, why are you tilling the soil? You're tilling the soil to grow grains. Why are you growing grains? You're growing grains because there's a military force that tells you if you don't grow grains for them, they're going to steal your stuff or kill you. This is the basis for state development thousands of years ago, right? But not thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago. This is all relatively new for humanity. Um, Homo sapiens have been around for 200,000 years at least. Potentially, evidence of modern humans goes back 400,000 years. But we know for a fact, stable populations of modern humans or Homo sapiens have been around for like 200,000 years now. What that says to me is that the majority of our evolution and our time here, we were living in relatively egalitarian societies, and we weren't causing the sixth mass extinction, which we know now is, one of the huge challenges that we're facing globally, is that humanity and civilization itself has expanded to this capacity where we've caused the sixth mass extinction in the history of the Earth. So if we look at this thing called the environments of evolutionary adaptation, which is how are our psyches, our bodies, our social structures, all of the things that make up who we are, how were those influenced by the environments that we were adapting in? What are we best adapted for? And if we think about that, then culturally, emotionally, socially, we would have been adapted mostly for a kind of communalism or anarchism that existed prior to any of the types of social organizations that we see today. And if you look at what we call immediate return hunter-gatherer societies, those are the societies that live in the most egalitarian way that's been studied really in the world. The equality among the people there is essentially the most we've seen in any society, past or present, really. So it's not all hunter-gatherers. There's lots of different distinctions between different types of hunter-gatherer societies. Some are more hierarchical, some are more egalitarian. And that has to do, generally speaking, if you look at the material realities that can make one way of life possible or not, that has to do with their subsistence strategies. So, for example, in the 70s, this anthropologist named James Woodburn, he coined the term immediate return and delayed return for hunter-gatherer societies, or societies in general. It doesn't have to be specifically hunter-gatherers. A delayed return society is any society that does a subsistence method that requires a lot of labor for a payoff in the future. Basically, societies that store food. So, or rather hoard food, not just cash food, but hoard food. That's a delayed return society. Immediate return societies are the ones who basically don't store food. When you're hungry, you go out into the environment and you find food in the wild and you bring it back to a camp and you consume it. You're seasonally, your migrations, your nomads, right? You're moving from gardens to wild tended places to wild tended places. Whereas a delayed return society is more sedentary. They're going to be fixated in one particular spot, and their subsistence strategy is going to be based on amassing resources and then storing them and then slowly subsisting off of those stored resources for a certain amount of time. And when looked at through that lens, you can see that food storage of that capacity or food hoarding increases the amount of uh, conflict between people. That could lead to violence, that could lead to hierarchy, could lead to all kinds of things. But you see an increase of conflict when there is basically stored energy that has to be protected from something. So when your food is all out everywhere and you don't have to worry about it, if you're hungry, you can just go find something somewhere. You don't have to defend a food source. But if you spend all your energy going and gathering a bunch of stuff and then you store it in a granary or something like that, now you have to spend all this time defending it because all that energy you expended is stored in that box. And so when you have to defend it, that's where the conflict arises because in generally in ecosystems, there's not a lot of stored food in that capacity. Everything wants to eat food, and basically you've generated a larder that other animals would like to get to as well. And so now you have a problem with pests because now you have mice or as an example, trying to get the grain or whatever out of your storage. So you have to fight the mice, you have to fight insects, you have to fight mold, and you have to fight other humans, right, to protect that food source. And we see this with sedentary societies that actually don't store food in the same capacity. There's actually a lot of like clam beds that are self-regenerating that created sedentary societies where we see an increase in conflict. And that doesn't necessarily mean an increase in hierarchy, doesn't necessarily mean anything other than just there's more conflict when people are sedentary in one place, and there's more of something that has to be defended on a regular basis. So that doesn't necessarily mean that just because those conditions exist, that a society is going to be hierarchical. But what it means is that you can get stuck in a perpetual feedback loop. Once a hierarchy gets going, it becomes really challenging to stop that hierarchy because now they have the means, the physical material means to maintain their power structure. So there have been, for example, more egalitarian agricultural societies. But once the hierarchy gets formed, if it does happen in those societies, it's really hard to step back unless there's a collapse of some kind, unless there's basically what we call diminishing returns. So if there's an amount of energy stored somewhere, diminishing returns is when you've consumed the majority of that, and now you're no longer in a growth phase, you're plateauing, and then you start to decrease. Easiest sort of example that I think most people know about with diminishing returns is peak oil, right? Like there's only a finite amount of oil, and once we hit the peak, everything else is diminishing returns. It becomes really more and more and more expensive to get oil that's in harder to reach places, more technology like tar sands. And then at some point, it's no longer viable. It takes as much energy to pull it takes a whole barrel of oil to pull a whole barrel of oil out of the ground. At that point, it's reached zero and it's impossible or there's no reason to pull it out anymore, right? But diminishing returns starts to decline well before that equal balance happens. Because if you're in a cycle of growth and you hit diminishing returns, you immediately start a cycle of decline or degrowth. Which some people advocate for a conscious degrowth, which I'm one of those people because I think it's a way of looking at an inevitable future of a lack of resources. And so to plan out that is something that I think is a really good idea because then you're not necessarily faced with that sharp curve, right? If you plan degrowth, you can have that curve be a lot softer than a stark contrast of losing those things. So that's diminishing returns. And all of these come back to subsistence, right? With subsistence, there are material means that allow us to continue something or transform it. I don't understand how we can get out of the cycle that we're sort of stuck in terms of growth, but I know that there are options out there. The reason we have subsistence as resistance as our theme is because to me, rewilding, and maybe I'll go into the etymology here. Um, the way we define rewilding here at Rewild Portland and the Rewilding Conference is essentially um, we have to kind of do a little journey. So I'm going to go on the etymology journey here. Um, wild is actually from the word wald. It's a Germanic origin and it just means forest. But there's a folk etymology that actually works better to kind of explain what wildness is. If you think about wildness as wildness, it makes a lot more sense when we contrast wildness or wildness with domestication, which oftentimes it's used as a contrast from something that is wild or something that is tame or domesticated. Wildness we tend to think of as things that are uncontrolled. There's a demonization and a romanticization that happens with wildness. You have the phrase "wild and free," which is the romanticization, and then you have the demonization, which is wild and crazy. Um, and so it's this weird thing in our society where we both like revere this sort of freedom, but then at the same time, it's like annoying that we can't subdue wild nature, right? If you think about what is broken when you break a wild horse, you're breaking their will, you're breaking their willedness. And so the even though willed is not the true etymology of wild, I think it's actually a more accurate sort of folk etymology that works in that sense. So we think of willed or wild as willed. Um, the re is an important component in rewilding because there's an acknowledgement there that something happened that removed us from that wilderness, right? Um, we're no longer able to have the same sorts of freedoms that we had as hunter gatherers. We're not necessarily egalitarian. We're being enforced. There's a system that forces us to do a particular thing. If we look at agrarian civilization, which we now a lot of people label as capitalism, we basically have to generate a surplus. So we're consuming more than we actually need to subsist to generate a surplus to give to a military or an elite group of people, which automatically means we're having to consume more than any other regular animal would to maintain a balance within their environment. Um, and so the re is an acknowledgement that there's been a separation, that we've removed ourselves in some way or other from the wildness. I don't really like to use the word domesticated that much anymore because I think a lot of people use it for all different kinds of reasons. I think most people conflate domestication with co-evolution. Um, Lots of different species co-evolve together. Domestication is one form of co-evolution. I don't think it's mutualism. I think you could differentiate domestication from mutualism. You have people like Michael Pollan who says things like, plants domesticated humans or we domesticated each other or something like that. I don't believe that's true. I believe that there are material reasons why humans domesticated grains and other plants and animals, but I don't think those animals wanted or in any way would be satisfied understanding if they could the trajectory of what domestication means for them. What you give up when you for so-called protection when you think about like freedoms and domestication. So, for example, the word domestication, dom means home, and we call it domestication because people started bringing animals, wild animals, into their homes at night to protect them from predators. Of course, humans are predators. So what they weren't really protecting them from predators. They were just protecting them from other predators, which if you think about it is a form of hoarding resources in an environment from all of the other creatures, right? So instead of going out and picking whatever wild food or letting it be for everybody, you've decided that this entire swath is now only yours. And it got more and more like that, right? With different animals. So a shepherd, their job was basically to protect, a herd or a flock of animals from other predators, which is basically just hoarding all those animals for yourself instead of letting everything sort of communicate or share food across different species and things like that. Domestication is this idea of bringing them into the domicile. It's also where the word dominate comes from, right? And dominion to make things of the house. And so when I think about rewilding, really though, domestication could be, even if you think about it, a subset of wildness, because you can't actually escape wildness. You could pretend, um, but even everything that we do is still happening within a congress of an ecosystem, even if we're the ones causing a destructive, some sort of destructive force through domestication. It's still happening within the grander scheme of things. We're just basically a very non-resilient society in that form of hoarding. Um, and so the and the wildness, re-willedness, if you will, that has to do with basically trying to find our way back to this relationship that humans had for millions of years, that where we lived in relative balance, where we did not hoard everything, we didn't domesticate everything. We lived in congress with the other wills, with other willed creatures and plants and everything, and elements and weather patterns and all of that stuff. And that kept us in a relatively equal balance. At some point, we lost that, and different societies around the world started figuring out different ways to um, deal with this Pandora's box, right? So there's lots of indigenous societies that started practicing horticulture, started coming up with cultural limitations to growth, cultural limitations to expansion, cultural limitations to consumption. There's a really great interview with Martin Prechtel that he did in 2000 in Sun magazine, and I highly recommend people read that one. It's one of my favorites, and it basically goes into this sort of concept of Mayan spirituality, which was linked to basically ecological debt. So if you had to extract something from the environment, you had to give something back. So there was this equal balance that was happening there. And so they created these cultural systems after the Mayan civilization had come and declined into, or rather adapted. There's a lot of language around this kind of stuff, right? Especially with civilizations where we talk about like collapse or decline rather than like resilience and adaptation. So if you're in a system that is failing, it is an adaptation to resilience to stop doing that thing, right? Like there's that book, Collapse, How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed. And that whole myth, that's a myth, right? Jared Diamond. He's creating this fake idea that there's a thing called failure and success with civilizations. Like if your society chooses resilience over consumption, that somehow that's a failure, right? It's absurd. And there's another book I would recommend called Questioning Collapse, that goes through actually chapter by chapter uh, Jared Diamond's book, Collapse, and it kind of debunks a lot of his stuff around that and showed that actually these societies didn't collapse in the way that we think of collapse. They actually returned to resilience. And a lot of those societies continue to persist today in different names. It's like people are like, well, the Mayans collapsed. Well, they're still around, right? They just didn't live at the scale that they did, and they came up with cultural technologies and mythologies and a deeper understanding of how to live in a better relative balance, right? So humans all over have been dealing with this sort of Pandora's box for tens of thousands of years, really. But in terms of like what we call the agricultural revolution, which is like not necessarily, it's not a revolution that happened globally all at once, but it is within the last 10,000 years all over the world, different societies that lived in what we call alluvian plains, which are a very specific geography. It's basically like a very flat floodplain. Over the last 10,000 years, in the majority of those large places where humans were inhabited, they created civilizations of this nature. In the most classic example that most people are familiar with is the Tigris and Euphrates River in the so-called Fertile Crescent. That's where a lot of the biblical stuff happens. But if you look at the Yangtze River in China, there was, the Han civilization based on rice. If you look at, I forget the river that flows in Ghana, there's sorghum. There was a civilization there in Africa. And still, I mean, all these still exist today. They're just mutated into different forms, right? The Mississippi River Delta complex here in North America. Of course, the Amazon had massive civilizations as well. And in the Andes, the actual alluvian plain isn't on the sea level. It's actually at 10,000 feet. So that's where the Inca civilization is. And they had quinoa. So there's these different societies that have basically figured out how to grow grains, had these growths and transitions to some other way of life. But some of them persisted and some of them interacted and created a sort of positive feedback loop. mostly obviously the ones across Eurasia that ended up utilizing the technologies of capitalism to expand and colonize other parts of the world, and got us to where we are now. So when we look at sort of the material realities, that's one of the deep aspects of what makes our particular society possible. The other aspect of that is, of course, our cultural beliefs and what we want to have happen, what we feel we need to have happen. When the power structures are in place, it's a lot harder to change those power structures if they're benefiting a few, that locks up the food and then enforces everybody to work for them in order to get that food. So that's sort of where we are in terms of stuck, right? We're stuck with this power structure, which is why we have the word resistance as part of our theme, because there are multiple ways of resisting these power structures that are forcing us to live in an economic system that's continuing the sixth extinction. And if we're to actually get out of the sixth extinction, it's going to require a return to resilience. And that return to resilience is going to require resistance, because the society, the powers that be don't want things to change. They want people to continue to generate wealth for them. Even if they're not thinking this on an individual basis, we're cultural animals. So this is just a system that is perpetuating itself. And systems perpetuate themselves through the material means and the cultural beliefs, right? And the cultural norms. And so we have to kind of approach this from multiple ways. One of those is the cultural norms, right? So what we do at the conference is we try to break the cultural norms, break out of that idea, explain the history of all of these things, explain what wildness is versus domestication, explain how we got to be where we are. And then, of course, to talk about things of types of resistance openly isn't the greatest strategy if you are trying to avoid any kind of backlash. But there are lots of forms of everyday resistance or passive resistance. And one of those is subsistence. So how we get our food, how we choose to participate in the economy is a huge part of how the powers that be are able to get the wealth that they use to, to then enforce people to stay in this system. And so being able to get your needs met, your subsistence outside of the current economic structure is a way of passively walking away from it. And I really like the expression of to walk away, which comes from Daniel Quinn, who is somebody who wrote about a lot of this stuff in the 90s and in pretty digestible ways in fiction and anthropology stories. But his premise of walking away from civilization, there isn't a lot of, in his book, Beyond Civilization, he says that civilization doesn't have a lot of defense mechanisms against people abandoning it, which actually isn't true. There's lots of ways of forcing people to continue to do what we do. But there's a really great book that I highly recommend by James Scott that's called Weapons of the Weak. And while it's specifically about Malaysia, you can kind of glean a lot of really good things from that book in terms of lots of different everyday resistance to try to transform society. And while those things aren't necessarily going to transform them or be noticed all that much, the impact of them is a lot larger and hasn't really been studied as much as it should be. And so that's why we have our subsistence as resistance theme for the Rewilding Conference. It's because we want people to understand both the material realities of the economic structure as well as the social implications of cultural beliefs. And that's what we are here to change. Boom, 30 minutes, nailed it. I want to open up to Q&A. If anybody has any questions, I can keep talking about all kinds of random stuff. But if you want to post questions in the Zoom chat, or you can raise your hand right here, because there's places, there's people in front of me too. I'm just going to do a little pan so everybody can kind of see where we're at here. Look, there's a little audience back here. Don't be shy. Comments? Yes. The question is, does Rewild Portland have any relationships with the groups that I mentioned, Earth First or Green Anarchy magazine? I mean, I'm friends with John Zerzan, who's the editor of Green Anarchy and basically coined the term anarcho-primitivism. Interviewed him for the Rewilding podcast. Um, I've been on his radio show a few times. So there's definitely like I don't have a much involvement with Earth First personally, but Rewild Portland itself as a community organization, there's definitely like people that butterflies that cross pollinate. I would say, yeah, yes. Say that again. Okay, the question for those online was, what suggestions do I have for communities to engage in subsistence in earlier stages of collapse? Yeah, I mean, there's so much. I'm actually like writing an outline right now of like everything that we teach at Rewild Portland. And it starts with like, basic survival skills and understanding survival skills, because that's sort of the, preparatory thing. You need to understand those things before you like go out into the woods, or, and that coalesces with like emergency preparedness, right? Like if you think about, I like the term first aid, or there's sort of like these three different categories, right? You have like first aid, surgery, preventative medicine, right? So you have like, how did Hazel say it? It was like the quick fix, the retrofit, and the ultimate or systemic transformation, right? So I think about that with Hazel. When I learned that those sort of three tiers from Hazel, who was talking about it in terms of permaculture, which is very much related to rewilding. Um, but if you think about it, like those three things, right? Like, what are the first things that you should do? Well, always you want to be ready for the first emergency that might happen. So, survival skills, emergency preparedness, that's kind of like the first little thing I would recommend getting into. Then the next level up is, um, bushcraft or gardening, or like, subsistence, right? So like, what is the wild food outside your house, right? What are the micro things? What can you garden? And the thing about most people, when you look at like a wild food book, right? Um, Most of them are like dandelion greens, chickweed, dock leaf. Like those are micronutrients, but those are not calories, right? Like you can't live on dandelion leaves. So your wild food book needs to have starches. It needs to have like those deep calories. Um, but the other thing about the wild food books is that they generally don't have regenerative strategies as part of the harvesting techniques. So, like for instance, if you were to look in a book that said like, "Oh, go gather cattails," you could just totally destroy a pond by taking all the cattails, right? And that's not going to do you any good in the long run. That's very like extractionist sort of ideology, which is where we got to be here in the first place, right? So people of place have these strategies for regenerative harvest, and a lot of these books, edible plant books, don't have them. I recommend, um, if you're in the Pacific Northwest, there's a book called Foraging the Pacific Northwest by Doug Doyer. And Doug Doyer is an anthropologist who's been working for decades with indigenous people up and down the coast. And they were approached by Timber Press to write an edible plants book, and actually asked the elders that he works with, asked Doug to write the book. And so he wrote it basically in tandem with a lot of the native people of the Northwest coast, to make sure that that knowledge was on every page with every plant. So every plant has a section in that book called Future Harvests that talks about how to maintain the life of that plant and not over harvest it. Another thing is, like Delia was mentioning last night, invasive species are a really great plant to kind of look at for subsistence, because they don't have any natural predators here. They're growing excessively. We don't need to be worried about them. We don't need to be worried about their continuation. We need to be worried about limiting them, right? And so by consuming invasive species, you don't have to worry as much in terms of understanding that regenerative relationship the way you do with native plants. Um, that's sort of one of the elements. And then also thinking about like gardening, people start with something small like tomatoes or something like that if you have the space to do it. But then again, are tomatoes calorie rich? Not really. They've got some decent calorie, but they're not that like starchy thing, right? And then if you really want to understand calories, like animal fats and proteins are going to be a huge component of that. Um, and so any kind of like, there's a book called The Collapse of Complex Societies. It's another one that I recommend. Again, all these books that I'm talking about are in the top 10 that I posted on Whova, in the book recommended reading. If you look for my post, The Collapse of Complex Societies talks about how when collapse happens, the majority of specializations kind of go away and everybody ends up doing subsistence stuff again. Um, if you look at like World War II, classic example, food production was, lots of things were, all of the production in the United States was putting towards the war effort. And so they had these things called victory gardens where they were having citizens, instead of getting their food from grocery stores or whatever the farmland was going to produce, fabric and textiles for military uniforms or whatever it was, um, people started producing a lot of their food in their home gardens. And there was some statistic like it was almost, by the end of the World War II, it was almost like 50% of people's food was coming from, their home gardens, their so-called victory gardens. So if we think about things like that and strategies, um, getting the emergency stuff first, and then the second part, which would be understanding various subsistence techniques, how to get the food that you need, what actually does the body need to subsist, right? That's huge. We don't really learn that. We don't learn how many calories a day do I need and how many do I find that, where do those come from? Um, and so, to me, that's an important thing of understanding, like, not just the macronutrients, but micronutrients too. Like we also need greens, dandelion greens, things like that. But understanding like nutrition, I think, is actually a huge component to understanding what our bodies need in a collapse type scenario, and how to try to get access to those kinds of food to keep our bodies resilient, so we can keep our communities resilient, during those times, right? So anything that you can learn to, not just when we talk about subsistence, it's mostly food, but also textiles, right? Like what are, how to start a fire. There's certain things, or where to gather firewood. What's the best wood for cooking on? What's the best wood for light? What's the best wood for heat? Just all these kinds of things that require, that our bodies require. I think of fire as such a central component because humans have been with fire for so long. Um, there's actually a lot of evidence that shows we are a fire adapted species. Our digestive tract is actually adapted to cooked food at this point. A lot of studies on people who do the raw food diet show that, like, over long term, they start to lose bone density, cavities. There's all kinds of stuff that, nutrition wise, our digestive tract has basically been adapted to eating cooked food, whether it's, vegetable or not. Um, the science behind that is very interesting. There's a book about it called Catching Fire. I'm not particularly a fan of that book, but, there's some studies in there that they talk about this, where, just one example, our digestive tract is actually half the size of our closest ape relative, a chimpanzee. So if you think about, I don't know how long a human is, like 30 feet or something like that. Think about that. Like a chimpanzee's digestive system is twice the length, and they spend all day like chewing their food, right? They're chewing it, chewing it, chewing it for a really long time, and then swallowing it, and then it's going through this long digestive tract. Humans, we started cooking our food, and the body, there's, one theory anyway, the body doesn't need to spend all this time chewing it and digesting it anymore because we're cooking it. The cooking is pre-digestion. And so when we think about, again, subsistence, nutrition, all these things, like, how do we get a fire? If our oven isn't working, in an emergency, or if we want to, be living off grid or whatever the reason, what are the things that physically we're adapted to? And so kind of like exploring that is, to me, one of the like primary things of understanding how do I live outside of this system? And I think that there's an important component here, when we talk about resistance and subsistence as resistance. It's like we're systematically not taught how to take care of ourselves, because then we are dependent on the system, right? So because none of us know these things, we have to participate in the taxation regime of states. But if you understand that, you can live outside of that. And that's the reason why they outlaw, and that's, literally poaching. The word poaching comes from, the early states, or, even like proto states or whatever, where poaching was basically the king had a forest and the king was allowed to hunt, but peasants were not allowed to hunt. And so if you hunted in the king's forest, you could get your hands cut off, you could be executed for trying to subsist outside of that that forced economic system that was being imposed on people. Um, there's a lot of, if you go into like the whole Robin Hood mythology, and like really Robin Hood did not steal from the rich and give to the poor. He was literally just a poacher. There's lots of different myths, and who knows if it was ever a real person in that sense. But the sort of historical evidence and research shows that if there was a so-called Robin Hood mythological character, he was just somebody that was like basically like a hillbilly, somebody who had escaped to the mountains and was like poaching and subsisting off in that way. Another book I'm going to recommend that's actually not on my reading list is called The Art of Not Being Governed. And that's also by James Scott, who wrote Weapons of the Weak. He also wrote Against the Grain, which is on my reading list. In The Art of Not Being Governed, he talks about the cultures of Southeast Asia in the mountain range there that essentially evaded state societies for thousands and thousands of years by just having a mobile subsistence strategy that worked well in the mountains. It was really hard for the rice grain states, the valley states, essentially to get up into the mountains to try to tax people. I mean, they weren't growing grain up there, so there was no real reason for them to get up there. And it wasn't until about 150 years ago when the industrial economy was able to put power lines and roads up into the mountains, and they sort of then claimed the people, the different states. There's 7 different countries there. Then they sort of were able to claim the different people and tax them. But for thousands of years, potentially, the people who were living in these mountains were just constantly changing their societies, their religions, their cultures, their languages, their subsistence strategies as a way of staying away from states. Because up until that time, states basically, we live in a very interesting era where we don't have a lot of pandemics anymore. Obviously, we just went through one that, a global one. So we're familiar with it a little bit. But before, 150 years ago, pandemics were just constantly ravaging agricultural societies before like antibiotics and things like that. Famine and pandemics go hand in hand with sedentary populations of humans that are living close together, because also the zoological diseases from animal domestication will jump the species barrier when you live in filth and close proximity. And if you think about it, nomadic people, small scale societies, when you defecate, you leave that spot. But when you live in the sedentary place, you're basically living in your own filth, right? And you're living in animal filth, and it accumulates. And so there's a reason why disease goes hand in hand with these societies. And if you read James Scott's Against the Grain, he kind of has a whole chapter about how much disease was actually going through so-called Neolithic village sites for thousands of years until relatively recently. So the idea of living in a grain-based society where you're having to overproduce grain for an elite class, your nutrition is poor, the likelihood of disease is high. People were abandoning these societies. There's also a lot of literature about how the Great Wall of China was not built to keep the Mongolians out of China. It was built to keep the Han Chinese agriculturalists in, because people did not like that way of life and they would flee it regularly. So anyway, if you read The Art of Not Being Governed, there's a lot of stuff in there that you can sort of read between the lines in terms of subsistence strategies to use as a form of resistance, as a form of escape. And that's just one example. If you look at one of the oldest languages in Europe is Basque, right? Basque might actually have origins in the hunter-gatherers who lived in Europe prior to the colonization. There were 2 waves of colonization that happened in Europe. One was the Proto-Indo-European nomadic horse riders who came in about 5,000 years ago, 4,500 years ago. And they basically obliterated a lot of the hunter-gatherer societies there, turned them into pastoral agriculturalists. And then you have another wave that comes in a few thousand years later that converts most of those people to agriculturalists. And they used to think that, agriculture is such a great way of living that the hunter-gatherers in Europe, they just adopted it because it was, the next level of technology, like, just getting a new iPhone. But but the reality, now that they've actually done DNA tests on the skeletons of Europe, the archaeology is replaced almost immediately, which is why they thought it was like this technological innovation. But now they're doing DNA tests on hunter-gatherers and people. And what they're realizing is that no, actually, it's not the same people who adopted the technology. What happened was you have a certain genetic population that are hunter-gatherers, and then like 100 years later, a completely different genetic population on top of them practicing agriculture. So we know what this is, right? This is colonization. And again, it's not something that only happened in Europe or that Europeans necessarily perpetuated. Now, Japan, for example, the island has the Ainu is the indigenous hunter-gatherer population there, and they looked at the DNA and have seen that the rice growers from what is now Korea actually essentially colonized most of Japan. The same is true of the genetics of Puerto Rico. They found that about 2,000 years ago, I think it was quinoa growers or amaranth potentially supplanted the population of hunter-gatherers there. And the more that they're doing this kind of testing, the more they're realizing this, right? So there's some weird thing that's going on where, and again, if we think about the word colonization, coller, to till the soil. So to colonize a people is to basically either take their land, take their soil, or assimilate them to be growing grain for whatever the state or whatever that hierarchical power is, right? So anyway, sorry, that was a long-winded answer to your question. And I see that there's a couple of questions in the chat here, so I'm going to scroll back. Okay, Peter, I'm curious what you think of the cradle-to-cradle conceptualization and work of William McDonough and Michael Brongart. Granted, it's an alternative approach to the rewilding movement, but I'm wondering if you're familiar with their work. I read Cradle to Cradle in high school, so I'm familiar with it, but it's been a really long time. I mean, that to me is, that's the same regenerative concept, right? I think that there are people who are like reinventing the wheel in terms of like understanding regeneration, and a tit for tat, where if we take something out of the environment, there has to be some sort of equalizing force that goes back into it. And I think when we hoard food, that's actually a huge implication that we're not doing a sort of tit for tat in that sense, because we're taking. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Do you mind if I jump in? Because
Sure.
they came up with a sequel, and granted, it's 10 years ago. But my takeaway from their work is that they're talking about that they're, in terms of the way that we create things, because human beings create things, that they talk about the need to divide things into a biological stream and a technical stream. And they're saying that the problem that we're dealing with now in terms of how we're creating sickness by putting it all together in landfills and destroying environments and people's health is that there is no separation of the two streams. And so they're saying that if there was a new way of thinking about what we create, and there were ways, instead of saying cradle to grave, that objects, that products actually have a lifespan, and that is considered in their creation, things were able to be taken apart, that there were actually systems in place to remove, like an example that they gave is solar cells, how solar cells are made with heavy metals that if they were released into the environment totally would poison everything really
Totally.
bad. But if they were taken apart, and if there were systems in place, technical systems in place to remove these heavy metals and to reuse them again until we come up with a more healthy, sustainable way of having solar power, then that would no longer be poisoning us. They also talk about the idea of how when you look at a cherry tree, for example, they use cherry trees as examples, how one would never look at a cherry tree and say, oh my word, what a mess. They're really just destroying the environment, all those leaves, all those fallen cherries, so they're saying, well, why can't we be creating things that we need in our society more with that as our model of that it's beautiful, that yes, there's an overabundance, but that it's not polluting, it's not
Yeah.
poisoning us.
Yeah.
So
I
it's a
mean,
very
again, I feel
exciting.
like there's, a book I would recommend is the Maya Forest Garden. Indigenous populations have figured this technology out. have figured out how to do these things all over the planet. And then there's a level of, one of the things we like to do at the Rewilding Conference is elevate those stories, because that's exactly what it's already known how to do that. What the reason why it's not happening is because it's not profitable to the contemporary, power structure. And so until there's a shift in, I don't want to say consciousness, but
Yeah, yeah.
until there's a shift in ideology and the material means that allow these people to continue doing what they're doing, it's gonna continue to do what it does. The other element here that we didn't really talk about is consumption. So um, even if we changed all of our technology right now to be regenerative, it's not going to stop the level of consumption of 8 billion humans that have caused the sixth mass extinction. So one of the things that is sort of left out of this conversation is like leaving room for everybody else. And when I say everybody else, I mean all the other species, right? Um, the idea of just having as many babies as you want because who cares is not really something that I've seen in indigenous cultures that live close to the earth, that are relatively living in an equal balance with their populations, right? Like birth control is a huge known thing among hunter gatherers, and they understand that they shouldn't have too many babies or something along these lines, right? Like you can kind of that's a whole sort of rabbit hole to go down. Um, the important thing to think about there is that agricultural society, when you start hoarding, what you're doing is saying everything belongs to me. I don't care about any of the other species anymore. Everything belongs to humans. All of these, reindeer, I'm going to take. I'm not going to let any of the other predators get them anymore. That is going to cause a chain reaction. It's another positive feedback loop of consumption. Because when you have that sort of hoarding mentality, what happens is any species that has more calories, it's called the Lotka-Volterra cycle, their population is going to grow. So, for instance, if you have an equal balance of lynx and snowshoe hare, which is their main food, then the populations of a lynx and snowshoe hare go like this over time. They fluctuate with one another. If there's a boom of snowshoe hare, you'll see slowly after that a boom of lynx. And that boom of lynx is going to depopulate the snowshoe hare. The snowshoe hare population slowly declines, and then the lynx population will slowly decline. Um, Humans basically this Pandora's box, this hoarding, is basically kind of like a hack. Like we've hacked to the limits of our growth. Some of those are natural, like geological. Some of those are, like with any species, some of these different species have other species that they specifically eat, like a lynx and a snowshoe hare. Humans, because we're hyper adaptable, we can eat anything. And if we choose to just decide that, okay, well, since we can eat everything, I'm just going to decide that everything in the world is something that I can eat, then our populations are going to grow because we're just going to start eating everything, which is which is exactly what happened, prior to agriculture. And so, you see this expansion of humans, Homo erectus, across Africa and Eurasia, and then later Homo sapiens, mingling with Neanderthals and Denisovans, and then spreading all over. And each of these pockets of humans are still living as hunter-gatherers, which has material limits to their growth, because you can only consume certain things if you haven't decided that the whole world is yours, right? But then at some point, you have this technology of hoarding, or this idea that, well, maybe we can just control our food supply rather than letting it be what it is. We're going to control the whole thing. And that's when you have this sort of negative, positive feedback loop of continuous growth within agricultural societies. And they can do this in a sedentary environment. And so they burn through that. And so there's no, I'm not, this gets into the sort of sketchy territory of what people call overpopulation. Some people call overpopulation, which is, again, I prefer the term carrying capacity, but carrying capacity, even in itself, is sort of a challenging term, because one of the first people who did the math on population was a racist, and so it's always sort of had these racist undertones of this racist guy blaming other countries or other groups of people for like overpopulating, when really it's this fundamental system under the whole thing of overconsumption. That's really what it is. Because if we think about it as consumption, population growth is a symptom of consumption. But if you look at it purely as consumption, then it's more along the lines of what you're talking about with cradle to cradle, where you have, one citizen of the United States whose consumption is like the amount of 200 people, 200 people living in India or something, right? So the level of consumption is not the same. So even though there are more people in other places, wealth and power and the frills that we have of luxury here means that our level of consumption is so much higher than people in other places. So it's not just population, really. It's consumption at the core, saying that I can do whatever I want, I can make whatever I want, I can transform the environment in any way that I want for my benefit. Um, and you have societies all over the world that have recognized this, seen this Pandora's box, and figured out ways of engaging with it. And that's not to say that these people don't fail in those engagements from time to time, or that because the material reality exists, if it gets out of hand, it's really hard to stop that system once it gets going, right? And so oftentimes, this is why I really love studying Mayan society and understanding it as much as I can, because they're a society that grew to a certain level, reached that level, realized it was unsustainable, and transformed their society into one that was smaller scale, more regenerative. And all of their spiritual practices and beliefs are roped into those ideas. And so they've found this sort of like what I would call like a middle ground, of dealing with this weird thing that humans have these intellects. We can transform the environment any way we want. So what's stopping us from doing that? That to me is the central sort of question of rewilding, is like, how much is too much? Yeah.
That ties into a thought that I have about material reality cultural forces that the hierarchies according to food and the cycle is death phobia
Totally.
and managing fear of those emotions, control the environment,
Exactly.
and be able to predict outcomes of,
Totally.
oh, are all my children going to live?
Yes.
Or am I going to be able to feed people who are injured? All of those things.
Totally.
I find missing from the conversation sometimes.
Yeah.
About, like, yes, subsistence is resistance. And like, yeah, let's become, but that also requires building cultural tools.
Exactly. Exactly. Totally.
Because when you're not used to dealing with, because that's been exported to a policing force or a government force, and that also reinforces our systems.
Exactly.
We can't resolve conflicts ourselves. Okay, that's why the laws and the courts
Yeah.
exist.
I'm concerned that people on here aren't hearing you. So I'm going to try to sum up what you said, which is that the material realities can shape us, and the cultural realities also do that. And part of the component here, why we would accept something of this material nature, is deeply entrenched in a fear of death, right? And if you fear death, then you want to control life. And so, if we think about agricultural societies, what they give people is predictability, at least for a while, right? Well, I know this acre can produce this amount of grain year to year, and I can give this quote unquote stability, right? It's not real, it's imagined, but it's the same thing if you think about anytime people are afraid of things, they give up those freedoms for protection, right? And this is like, again, if we think about domestication, what is an animal giving up for the protection of humans, right? They're not actually being protected, they're being predated upon. I think it's the same kind of thing. I think when we look at these sort of state level societies, what they're doing is protecting people to an extent, but also then enslaving them at the same time. And in order to actually, so subsistence as this, is a part of the material reality, but the cultural reality is that we have to also explain these things and think about our fear of death, think about, which is, again, why we have this conference. Oftentimes people come to the Rewilding Conference and they're like, why do you have somebody speaking about this? This has nothing to do with rewilding, for instance, and we're like, actually, all of these things are deeply related to rewilding, because rewilding is a cultural movement. Rewilding is not just, planting back wild things or eating a dandelion from your yard, right? It's this whole thing. We have to come at it from all of these different angles. And so, while the theme of the conference is subsistence as resistance, and we always have at least one person, talking about subsistence, the majority of the other speakers are talking about all kinds of other things. And this is why, because the material conditions are super important, and we want to have that always sort of present. But then we're also feeding in all of the cultural things that are necessary for us to keep our society, to keep the momentum of the rewilding movement. And I'm sorry, that's my time. It's 10:02. We'll start back up at 10:30. If you have questions that didn't get answered, themes you want to talk about, bring them up at the open space tomorrow, or post them in Whova under the chat. We've got a 30-minute break, and then we'll come back with Paul A. Wood. Thank you so much.